I'd like to introduce you to that presenter here in just a moment. So as a reminder, today's session is Adolescent Cognitive and Psychosocial Development. This training will provide an overview of adolescent cognitive and psychosocial development, including the major developmental tasks during adolescence, discussing the linkages between cognitive, physiological, and psychosocial development and life events on adolescent health, behavior, and the development of competencies, as well as the influence of contextual factors and life events on development. So to do that, we have with us Dr. Kathleen Tebb. Good morning, Dr. Tebb, I see ya, who is a developmental and health research psychologist whose research focuses on developing, evaluating, implementing, disseminating evidence-based interventions to promote health equity amongst diverse and underserved adolescents, young adults, and their families. And with that, I will ask our Caltrin audience here. I see you applauding. I appreciate you. We'll give her a round of applause with your reactions as we welcome Dr. Tebb.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I really appreciate it. And I'm honored to be here. And I'm just so grateful that so many of you have decided to share your time with me today. I'm incredibly grateful for that. I know you have a lot of choices and a lot of responsibilities, so it's a particular honor to have you here. I wanted to thank Casey and Jessica for their support. I did make some last minute changes to my slides. That's just the nature of who I am and how I work in my ongoing commitment to ongoing quality improvement efforts. So the link in the chat is the link to the most current note-taking slide decks. And then, of course, thank you to Carmen, our interpreter. So before I begin, I wanted to let you know that what we're going to cover today took me years to accomplish, to understand, and to earn my PhD. So what you're getting today is, well, it's a long 3-hour training. In the big picture, it's more like a crash course. We have an ambitious but doable agenda. And by the time of our end of our time together, it's our goal that you will be able to describe the major cognitive and psychosocial changes that take place during adolescence, that you'll be able to analyze some of the influence of contextual factors and life events on the development of both adolescent competencies, as well as their unhealthy risk behaviors. And ultimately, what we're all about is to provide you with tips for you to be able to apply some best practices to support positive developmental outcomes for adolescents. And from my perspective, I just think it's so incredibly helpful to understand the science of adolescent development so we can have a better sense and greater understanding and appreciation of how to apply this knowledge when developing programs, policies, and practices that are really designed to support youth on a path toward healthy outcomes in adulthood. And I should also add to my background that in addition to my research focus and years of training, I'm a mother of 2 young adults right now, ages 20 and 23. It's hard for me to even wrap my head around that. And I am an aunt to 50 nieces and nephews, and that is no exaggeration. So a little context there for you. So I have some both academic as well as personal experiences that I hope to share with you today. So as most of you know, adolescence is one of the most rapid phases in human development. It's marked by the period between sexual maturation and the attainment of adult roles and responsibilities. And what we know and have a greater understanding and appreciation for now is that biological changes associated with puberty come often well before the psychosocial maturity. And when I talk about psychosocial, I'm really referring to the interconnections between psychological and social factors. They encompass the interplay between an individual's mental and emotional development in the context of their social environment. During adolescence, there are dramatic changes across multiple domains: physical, physiological, cognitive, and psychosocial. Adolescents are adjusting to these changes in a social and cultural context, where peers play an increasing role, though it's so important to remember that parents remain critically influential. And it's also a time with a lot of to-dos. I have this check-off to-do list here. Adolescents are seeking greater independence, but they have to navigate this in the context of family, school, work, and their peers. They have to adjust to demands for behavioral maturity from their parents, from their teachers, and from their larger society. At the same time, they have to handle changes to their changing body, their growing sex drive, peer relationships, and of course, evolving romantic relationships. They also make major strides in the development of their identity as they prepare for adulthood. So today I'll be covering the dramatic changes that occur throughout adolescence, and we'll discuss these various domains, the cognitive and especially the social emotional changes across early, middle, and late adolescence. So as I mentioned, adolescence begins with puberty, which is a process of physical and psychological and emotional development that's really triggered by a cascade of hormones released in the endocrine system. There's no strict definition of when adolescence actually begins and when it actually ends. The start of puberty can vary by 4 or even 5 years around the mean. Puberty generally lasts from 2 to 4 years. And I really like this visual because it highlights the developmental periods between early adolescence and young adulthood, which, as you can see, aren't really marked by strict age boundaries. There's a lot of variation here. And it's important to note that changes in the areas of physical, cognitive, and social emotion domains often overlap and intersect, and that age is really a rough proxy for development. And while the major physical developmental milestones of adolescence happen to everyone and in generally the same sequence, the timing of these milestones varies a lot, both between and within the sexes. So what you'll see is some adolescents exhibit physical signs of maturity much sooner than their peers, while others will exhibit them later. So, for example, the timing of a female's first period can vary quite a bit. Girls can start their period as early as age 8 and as late as age 16. So, our intervention approaches, our conversations, our public policies all need to take into account their development. For example, how you would talk to a 10-year-old about sex and reproduction should and would look quite different than how you might have that conversation with a 17-year-old. So I'm going to talk briefly about sex differences in the timing of development. Generally, boys lag behind girls about 1 to 1.5 years for both physical and psychosocial development. You can see this in the graph that the height spurt for girls is on average earlier than boys, and so are their secondary sex characteristics like breast development in females and voice changes in males. And on this second graph, you can see that the girls are indicated in the dark blue bar, and their cognitive and psychosocial maturation again occur about 1 to 1.5 years earlier than males, which is indicated by the red bar here. And research confirms what we observed. This is a classic photo taken at a middle school dance, highlighting that differential timing in the height growth spurt between boys and girls. And we were all teenagers once. And when I talk about adolescence, I think it's really helpful for us to reflect back on our own adolescence. And I'll just share a brief personal experience. I'm the youngest of 5 children. My older siblings were all adopted within 1 to 2 years apart. Um, Needless to say, my parents had their hands tremendously full, and there actually aren't many photos of me as a child and as a teenager. But I dig deep into the archives and found this one from my 16th birthday. And it's so funny as I look back at this photo, I still have that discrete and vivid memory of being embarrassed by what I thought was the most prominent zit on my chin that anyone could possibly ever have, sort of that pure egocentrism perspective. So, I'd like us to pause for just a moment and get us all grounded back to when we were adolescents. Think about what you were like as an 11-year-old, what you were like when you were 14 or 15-year-olds, and how that was similar or different to what you were like when you were 17 or 18 as you were moving into young adulthood. Might there have been life events that have shaped your development? So just kind of let's take a step back in time. And you don't have to share. This is a webinar. I typically love to hear people share, but I also want to respect everyone's privacy. For me, I was a very late developing adolescent, and I was incredibly shy and introverted. Hard to believe that when you see me now. My parents got divorced when I was 12, a life event that many adolescents experience, and that contributed to me withdrawing even further. I had conflicting feelings about my parents, and I spent a lot more time with my peers. I have to say my older siblings really stepped up and filled a parenting void that my parents left while they were struggling with their own interpersonal conflicts and dynamics. I also had an amazing middle school teacher. I mean, I don't even know if this could happen today, but he selected me as one of 7 students to go on a 10-day backpacking trip in the really remote areas of Upper Yosemite, kind of out of Tuolumne Meadows, if some of you are familiar with that area. And this trip was pivotal in helping me break out of my shell, develop newfound confidence, friends who liked things that I liked in terms of outdoors and philosophy. And it really fostered a lifelong love of the outdoors, which I carry with me and my family today. Of course, puberty takes place in the social and cultural context, as you can tell with my own personal experiences, and of course, as you reflect on your own. And what we see in the research is that there are differential effects when puberty happens, which can affect girls differently than it can boys. And I'll go into a little detail about that. So, for all adolescents, pubertal changes in general can present some challenges. They can lead to feelings of discomfort, a little bit of anxiety, some self consciousness, especially if adolescents are not well informed about the process. They may worry that they don't fit in, especially if they don't look like others their age. And these variations can also lead others to treat them differently in a way that maybe doesn't match their cognitive or development. They're reacting to their physical attributes rather than where they might be emotionally or cognitively. So if you think about the normal distribution curve, it's that classic bell-shaped curve. Early matures make up about 10 to 15% of the distribution. And being an early maturing male, especially in the Western US culture, tends to be advantageous. Early maturing boys are often perceived as stronger, more mature, more responsible, and they're viewed as leaders. And they're often treated differently. And this differential treatment is somewhat like a self-fulfilling prophecy because their treatment reinforces and sustains these advantages. Then, in contrast, early maturing females tend to have challenges. In particular, they may face unwanted attention or sexual advances, as adult males might think they are a lot older than they are. So, some strategies to support early maturing females, including engaging youth with age appropriate activities, age appropriate clothes and books, etc. It's important to develop skills and talents that aren't related to appearance. This includes a wide range of talents and learned competencies, such as things that involve their intelligence, their creativity, their humor, their kindness, and opportunities for leadership roles, among many other activities and competencies. It's also important to enhance social skills, focusing on things like active listening, practicing empathy, and improving those ever so critical communication skills. And then, of course, working on strengthening relationships with family and female peers through mutually enjoyable activities and outings. And of course, for early maturing girls, it's especially critical to stay alert to signs of potential sexual harassment and abuse, since they are at risk for that. And many of the strategies for supporting early maturing females can also be used to support late maturing males. And in honesty, all adolescents. For boys who are late to develop, it's especially important to participate in organized activities in which abilities are prized over their appearance. So this can include sports such as, I don't know, like martial arts, or perhaps running or cycling. It could include activities like chess or drama or some other clubs. And of course, whatever the youth interests are should be nurtured, and their activities should be based on their own interests. Again, it's important to provide opportunities to enhance their social skills and provide them with opportunities to really strengthen relationships, both within their family, with their peers, and other caring, supportive adults. I think above all, it's absolutely critical to let adolescents know that what they are going through is normal, even if it doesn't feel normal. And normal development covers a wide range. Even older adolescents and sometimes their parents are concerned with fitting in. So it's really important to remind teens that despite their concerns, their own personal developmental path is okay, even if it's different from their peers. And we see how important it is to encourage adolescents to have a positive view of their bodies, especially when it's going through these rapid changes. Parents and other adults play a large role in adolescents' nutrition and exercise. They model eating behaviors, and they support access to healthy foods. And we see that adolescents become more active and involved when their families engage with them in doing things like dancing, biking, walking, or cooking, those shared opportunities to really engage with teenagers. Because even though they're adolescents and they're pushing away from their families to some extent, they still really need their families and their caregivers in their lives. And I cannot underscore the importance of sleep during adolescence. It helps them grow, it strengthens their bodies, and it helps them perform better in school, sports, and other activities. And I'll circle back to sleep in a little bit here too. Here's one of the knowledge polls that I gave you, and I'd love for you to weigh in here now for a minute before I get into this particular topic. So what I would like to pose to you is adolescence a period of heightened storm and stress, marked by conflict with parents, mood disruptions, and risk behaviors. What do you think is true? Is it false? And it's totally okay if you feel like you don't know.
We have about 48% of people. Oh, perfect. Once we get to about 75% on the responses, then I'll go ahead and I'll end it and then I'll share the information for you.
Thank you. Okay, so 96% of you thinks it's true, and 2% false, and 2 said that you don't know. Well, thank you so much for doing that. And the reason I like to ask this question is that it really provides us an opportunity for us to think about some of the assumptions and biases we have about adolescence. So let's talk a little bit about what the research says. So a famous psychologist by the name of Stanley Hall coined the term storm and stress. And he did that to characterize what we often see in adolescence, that it is a time with decreased levels of self-control, heightened sensitivity, increased conflict, and increased risk and negative behaviors. However, What the research actually shows when you look across the full population of adolescents um, is that most adolescents actually navigate the adolescent transition relatively smoothly. Studies conducted across the globe in the US, Australia, Bangladesh, Hungary, Israel, Italy, Japan, Taiwan, Turkey, and West Germany found that almost 75% of adolescents report that they generally enjoy life. They perceive themselves as able to exercise self-control. They value work and school. They feel confident about their sexual selves. They express positive feelings towards their family, and they felt they had the ability to cope with life stresses. So it somewhat challenges this assumption we all hold about adolescence being solely a time of storm and stress. The storm and stress characterization um, really does a disservice to adolescence in the sense that it doesn't acknowledge all of the incredibly positive things that happen during the adolescent period, where we see a real burgeoning of desirable behaviors like kindness and empathy and growing responsibility that we see during adolescence. Yeah, of course, it's not without its challenges, but I think it's important for us all to remember the positive side of adolescence and that most adolescents don't experience this storm and stress that is largely a myth. So rather than characterizing adolescence as a period of storm and stress, I'd like to challenge you to think about, and what I really see, it's a time where we see quite a paradox. And what I mean by that is that adolescence is marked both by triumph as well as turmoil. Adolescents possess great potential, especially as they engage more deeply with the world around them. It's really a time of curiosity and exploration where they're trying new activities, they're beginning to think more critically and develop more varied and complex relationships. They're also becoming more aware of their skills and their talents, and they express their creativity and can be really funny. My kids crack me up all the time with the things that they say and the things that they do. Yet it can also be a time of turmoil where we see a rise in unhealthy risk behaviors, greater impulsivity, poor decision making. And while increased risk taking can be adaptive, I mean, think about it. There's risk taking that it is involved with public speaking or acting on stage or to compete in sports. Those are all positive risk taking behaviors. Teens' brains are actually wired to try new things. And as I used to talk to my teens when they were, in this turbulent time, they should be able to experiment, and they should be able to make mistakes. But unfortunately, what we see in adolescence is sometimes the consequences are quite severe. So after that show of research, I'd like to ask you now if you still think adolescence is a period of intense storm and stress. So I don't know if you can tell, but I love adolescence. I really do. I often say that toddlers and teenagers are my two favorite age groups, and I think it's because it's really a time of tremendous growth, and that you really see them develop that sense of self. And during adolescence, they really establish patterns of behavior that are related to diet, physical activity, substance use, and sexual activity that have impacts both in the short and immediate term, as well as well into their future. And what we see is that most adolescent morbidity and mortality is preventable. So I think this really is what motivated to devote my life to adolescence and adolescent intervention. Um, all the changes that are taking place, the newfound cognitive capabilities that they have, really presents a window of opportunity for intervention. Um, and What I want to share now is some of the incidences of this preventable morbidity and mortality. So, adolescent accidents are the leading cause of adolescent death in the United States. Many of these involve alcohol. As most of you know, you're in this field, we are experiencing a mental health crisis. And while rates of mental health problems increased during COVID pandemic, the pandemic really exacerbated mental health issues, and we're still continuing to see the fallout of that. Between 10 and 20% of youth experience a mental health disorder each year, but only 50% of all youth in need receive care. It's just, we can and we will and we must do better. Half of all lifetime mental illnesses begin by age 14 and 75% by age 24. So you really see the importance of thinking about and addressing mental health during this period. More than 70% of youth in the juvenile justice system have a diagnosed mental health illness. So there's really that interplay of the justice system and a misunderstanding of the needs of adolescents. Suicide is now the second leading cause of death among adolescents and young adults in the United States. And there are important and longstanding disparities. For example, rates for transgender young adults are 12 times higher. 82% of transgender youth considered killing themselves, and 40% have attempted suicide. What we know from the research is that gender-affirming care greatly improves the overall mental health and well-being of gender diverse, transgender, and non-binary children and adolescents. With regard to alcohol, tobacco, and other drug use, I use the term ATOD. According to the National Youth Risk Behavior Survey, 29% of high school students reported that they drank alcohol in the past 30 days. I mean, that means that most didn't drink alcohol, but still it's a much higher rate than we would like to see for sure. And 14% of adolescents report binge drinking, which involves consuming 5 or more drinks in a row. 17% report having ridden as a passenger with a driver who has been drinking alcohol. And 22% report marijuana use, and this is now on the rise. Nearly 13.5% use tobacco product, and most of this now is via e-cigarette use. Among adults who smoke cigarettes daily, 9 out of every 10 adults who smoke cigarettes regularly first tried smoking before they were 18 years of age. With regard to sexual risk, this has been a area of focus of my work. 15 to 24-year-olds account for 50% of all new sexually transmitted infections in the United States, but this age group only makes up 1/4 of the population represented. And of course, teen pregnancy has declined steadily over the past several decades. I think we can all applaud ourselves for this great work. At the same time, it's still higher than all other industrialized nations. And we've seen a recent attack with defunding Title X, the safety net for contraception services. So I'm very concerned we might see these trends slip in the wrong direction moving forward, but we shall see. Moving on to diet and exercise, the percent of overweight adolescents has more than tripled since 1980. More than 17% of 12 to 19-year-olds are considered overweight, and only 19% of high school students are considered physically active for 20 minutes or more 5 days a week. So that's not a lot of exercise. And then a very small proportion, 2.7%, have reported a lifetime prevalence of an eating disorder. And across all of these domains, ATOD, sexual health, diet and exercise, we see significant and unacceptable health disparities that are really persistent, especially for youth who face tremendous barriers, including gender and sexual minority youth that I've talked about, youth of color, youth from low-income backgrounds, youth in foster care, youth who are homeless or unhoused, and youth from underserved and youth in rural regions. So our approaches need to really be sensitive to these contexts. And the fact that these disparities exist among these groups of populations points to the influence of what I call upstream social drivers of health disparities. Now I'm going to switch gears after I take a sip of my tea and give you an overview of the developmental changes during adolescence. And I'll start with cognitive development before I move on to some of the psychosocial developmental changes that we see. And to help us understand what changes are taking place, it really helps us to inform our work. And to begin, researchers and theorists have spent over a century trying to solve a driving question. It's the same question that has plagued many of us parents. I wonder if you can guess what this question is. What were you thinking, right? I hear this all the time. I try not to say this to my children, but I have thought it way too many times. And from the teen's perspective, they would say, I was thinking I was going to get away with it and not have to explain it. But in reality, a teen's response to this question can vary widely depending on their context and their emotional state. They might respond to this statement in a defensive tone, or they might give you an angry response saying something like, I don't know, or it wasn't that bad. This can be a sign of them feeling judged or maybe even embarrassed. So instead of getting defensive back, which is so easy for us to do, right? My mantra is to remain calm, lean in, and try to understand their perspective instead of getting into that power struggle. It's much easier said than done. I find that I'm much better with other teenagers than I was with my own children. I'm going to be honest with you here. They might respond sarcastically or they may be dismissive. This can be a way of them avoiding the question or maybe expressing frustration. Again, try to stay calm, maybe gently encourage them to elaborate on what they mean or what they're thinking or what they're experiencing. They might simply not respond at all, either because they don't want to talk about it or because they're overwhelmed. In this case, and this is really hard for me to do, and that's to be patient and create that safe space for them to come back later to revisit it and to share. They may not be ready in the moment, but if that space is open, they might come back at another time when they're ready to have the conversation. Oftentimes, we as adults are much more prepared to have that conversation and want to solve the problem or get to the meat of the matter right in the moment. I found that sometimes the most honest conversations happened in the car while I was driving and not looking at them in the eye, but looking ahead at the road. And then, they sort of go on that stream of consciousness. In other cases, they might not understand why their action was wrong. And that can be a sign that they may need a little more guidance and support in thinking through the behaviors and the reasons for their behaviors. Yeah. And in some cases, they might even try to give you an honest answer and genuinely try to explain their reason, even if it may not be the best one. So I have to give you a funny example. When my daughter was, she was 17 about, and she went on an away trip for a competition with her team. Right before they left, a mom was supposed to take them on this away trip, and the mom called me, and she was very stressed out. And an emergency came up, and would it be okay if her older adult son, I think he was like in his early 20s at the time, could drive them to the competition? So I knew the family, and I gave them the green light. Um, my daughter came home from the trip and she was on cloud nine. I asked about the competition and oh yeah, that was fine and great. But what she really wanted to talk about was the trip with this older boy who was driving the car. And so I asked her, how the trip went, especially the drive, since that's what she seemed like she really wanted to talk about. And she just went on and on to explain how much fun it was, that they had loud music and everybody was chatting and it was so fun. And when they got to an open road, he went up to 90 miles an hour and it was awesome. And I just my insides just sunk. And I didn't say anything, but I think the look on my face said it all. Because then my daughter went on to justify that it wasn't at all reckless. There was no one on the road. He was a star athlete and he had an amazing reaction time. I mean, like way better than most teens. And everybody was in the car was wearing seatbelts anyway. So while she was trying to be honest in her rationale, it was not quite the rational thinking I was hoping for as a parent. So I paused, I took a deep breath. I showed her I heard what she was saying. I acknowledged that, yeah, he really is a great athlete, as is she. And then followed up really gently with a conversation related to a recent fatality that a teen driving in Marin was going too fast, hit a curve, and ran into a tree. So, you know, instead of blaming her, trying to take that incident and make an analogy to somebody else who was in a similar situation and kind of depersonalize it and talk more about the real risks and how important she is. And that's why we care. And that's why I react with that sort of aghast look, right? To explain my response to the behavior as well. By remaining calm and approaching these situations with empathy, understanding, and patience, like I said, it's easier said than done. You can really help teens to develop their emotional intelligence and to learn from their mistakes. So, there are significant cognitive changes during adolescence. I'm sure many of you have heard of Jean Piaget. He was a Swiss psychologist known for his research and theory of cognitive development. And he was famous for really describing the stages that children pass through in the development of intelligence and formal thought processes. He was really among the first, which is why he has had such a lasting impact on our field, that the cognitive changes in children that we see were fundamentally different than the cognitive processing of adults. And you probably know most of these stages, so I'm just going to go over this really briefly. But stage one, it occurs in the first 2 years of life where children explore and learn about their world through their senses. Basically, they touch and put everything in their mouth. That's how I remember that stage. Stage two is the pre-operational stage, and it's characterized by the development of language and symbolic play. So think 2 years, language development comes into play. And language is symbolic. So it's common at this age to see a preschool child riding a broom as if it was a horse. Logical thought or concrete operations emerges at stage three, where their understanding is still really based on what they can experience directly. So the classic concrete operation example is conservation. At this stage, they recognize that when a specific amount of water, say from a tall, narrow glass, is poured into a flat, wide glass, that amount of water is the same regardless of the glass that it's poured into, even though one of the glasses may look bigger than the other. The fourth and final is the formal operational stage. Adolescents become much more adept at abstract thought at this time, as well as deductive reasoning. So they can increasingly are able to systematically solve problems. You see this with the long division that's required, right? That systematic problem solving. They can also take this into the social domain, and that can influence their ability to imagine different possibilities, and that can further enhance their problem solving and decision making. What's fascinating is that these new cognitive competencies have implications on their psychosocial development. So the ability to think more abstractly allows for emotional growth and the development of emotional competencies. There's an increased ability to recognize identity, describe and respond to one's own emotions, as well as to the feelings of others. And this involves that ability to consider other people's views and other people's perspectives. In adolescence, identity also shifts from a concrete type of identity, which is shaped largely by what I do, to more complex and abstract notions of the self, especially in relationship to others. Adolescents may be more susceptible to social comparisons during this time. Adolescents are also able to consider the future and entertain what-if type questions. And these what-if hypothetical scenarios can inform decisions and really help adolescents think about possibilities and options in their futures. At the same time, if it's left unchecked, this same capability can spiral or cause anxiety or worry or stress. And as I mentioned previously, identity development is a major task during adolescence. Building off of Piaget, Erik Erikson was like the prominent theorist in identity development. And he proposed an 8-stage theory of identity development. These stages are set by society's expectations to accomplish specific developmental tasks. And according to Erikson, each task, when successfully resolved, it provides a particular strength to identity development. And so I'm just going to talk briefly about stages 5 and 6 because those pertain to adolescents and young adults. So in adolescence, as I mentioned, identity shifts from that concrete what I do to the more complex abstract notions of who I am. And according to Erikson, stage 5 involves an intense exploration of personal values, of beliefs and goals. And at the end, success of this stage leads to what he called the virtue of fidelity, indicating stability and commitment to one's own identity. And according to Erikson, this is not according to me, failure to answer this question results in confusion. Stage 6 begins in young adulthood with the task of developing intimacy versus isolation. At this stage, the individual either finds someone to engage in a mutual sharing and trusting relationship to really develop that sense of intimacy. If not, then the individual feels isolated and alone. Marcia, a student of Erikson, theorized that adolescent identity really fit into 4 categories, and you may have heard about these. So the first is identity achievement, and this really involves the successful integration of the identity that they held in childhood, which was largely shaped by their parents' identity and the values that they grew up. And there's a reconciliation with their own emerging values and goals. Identity foreclosure is results when identity is externally defined. This stems from parents or authority figures who are more rigid and strict in what they expect for their adolescent. And so it restricts the appropriate exploration of roles and values. The next is identity diffusion, and this is really low exploration of one's identity, a low commitment to their identity development, or becoming maybe even overwhelmed or unaware of their options, and sort of inertia sits in. And the last concept is identity moratorium. And this is really delayed identity formation. So it's basically on hold as one explores more and more and more options. And Erickson would argue identity needs to be resolved for successful transition to adulthood. However, I and many other psychologists now argue that it's maybe completely reasonable for adolescents, young adults, to need time to explore, say, their educational and their career goals, their relationship goals, and such. Kohlberg also built off of Piaget's. You can really see Piaget's influence in the psychosocial stage here. And he created a theory of moral development. And like identity development, adolescents shift from pre-conventional morality with an emphasis on the consequences, punishments, and rewards to a conventional, whoops, sorry about that, a conventional morality, which is characterized by an acceptance of social rules concerning right and wrong. Pre and early adolescence, authority is more internalized, and it's not really questioned. The reasoning is based on the norms of the group to which the person belongs. The conventional stage is where there's more of an acceptance of social rules concerning right and wrong. And then again, according to Kohlberg, this third stage is post-conventional, in which a person believes in universal ethical principles that apply to everyone. So in this stage, there's a willingness to perhaps defy the rules in order to achieve higher morality. And he argued that abstract thinking was required at this higher level of moral reasoning. And the way that they assessed morality is kind of interesting. It's called the Heinz dilemma. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with it. You may recognize the Heinz dilemma question. So basically, they assess morality by posing youth with a question, with basically a scenario. So Heinz's wife is seriously ill and has cancer and needs a life-saving drug, and he can't afford it. They raised some money, but they didn't raise enough. He explained his desperate situation to the person who manufactured this new drug, but they refused to give it to him, stating that he has the right to make money and that people have to pay for this medication. And then the researcher asks the child or the adolescent or the adult if he should steal the drug and or not, and to explain their choice. So an example of conventional morality would be that he should not steal the medication because it's illegal to steal under any circumstances, because of course that would be breaking the law. And then an example of post-conventional thinking would be something like, well, while it may be wrong to steal, in this case, it's okay because he needs the medication to save his wife's life, especially because the manufacturer is withholding medication to make money, and she's going to die without it. So she has a right to live. So he should go ahead and steal the medication. So I'm not here to say that one is right and the other is wrong. Rather, I'm highlighting how this type of questioning and how this type of reasoning was used in research to form our these theories of moral development. So as you can tell, there are definitely critiques of these theories, right? While they have made lasting and really important contributions to the field, I think it's also incredibly important to be mindful of their limitations, because we still see their influences in interventions, in writings, in day-to-day language, in perceptions. So with regard to formal operational thinking, such as advanced cognition, I'm sure you've seen this within yourselves, with your children, with relatives and others, that sometimes it operates really well in some areas, but not in other. My youngest child, she is off the charts in emotional intelligence. I mean, really off the charts. But then, she tries to go to make a dental appointment, and it may take her like 3 weeks to get that done. So she definitely has these islands of competence, as do I. Further, cognitive abilities don't always match the behaviors. So just because they have the capacity for long-term thinking and planning doesn't mean that they're always going to use that newfound skill. We know that trauma and stress and even pressure from the in-moment task, or as well as peer pressure, those can all impact our logical thinking. And in addition, the emotional experience plays a critical role in cognition, as does memory, attention, and metacognition, or thinking about thinking. So, and others argue that not all adolescents or even adults develop formal thinking. And I think we can all look to some recent politicians as example of adults who may not have formal operational thinking abilities. There are a number of critiques. Thank you for your reactions. I really appreciate it. It's hard when I don't, when I can't hear you. So thank you. There are other critiques. Cognitive and psychosocial development can be disrupted or facilitated by personal traits or other social contexts. For example, formal education in science and mathematics actually can promote the development of formal operational thinking. But studies also show the experience of detrimental environments and how those can stunt learning and cognitive development. For example, childhood emotional abuse and neglect actually can result in some permanent changes to the way the developing brain is wired. And further, the process of identity development continues to evolve well into adulthood. I'm in my 5th decade of life, and I think I'm still developing my identity and learning and discovering new things about myself as I change and evolve over time. And life events impact our identity development, where you might have been in a significant car accident, lost a loved one to COVID or other issues. A whole suite of things affect how we evolve in terms of our identity development. Let's see. And I think it's also important to understand that our research has been full of biases. And I cannot understate that enough, or underscore that enough. It's been conducted primarily in the US and in other Western industrialized countries and with convenient samples. When I talk about some of the universals of development, I try to draw back on my years of studying cross-cultural child development and teaching that at the University of California, Davis in their child development classes, because I think that cross-cultural perspective is really, really helpful in thinking about how we are human and our shared similarities and those universal processes, as well as how culture and context affects development. So we need many more studies that are inclusive of the diverse range of populations, gender identities, racial ethnic groups, subcultures, to really begin to untangle and address biases. Many of the studies that were done traditionally are conducted solely in the laboratory under controlled situations, and they lack ecological validity or relevance in real world settings. And then lastly, there's been way too much focus on the individual with less regard to the context and the upstream drivers that influence development. More recently, there have been some really exciting advancements in on adolescent brain development. And in all honesty, it has confirmed some, but not all of the observations that theorists have made. Research on brain development has advanced our understanding of the brain as a work in progress, and it provides key insights into adolescent risk behaviors. The adolescent brain, we now know, is fundamentally different than the brain of adults. Piaget observed that, and research on brains are confirming this. I like to have this a visualization. It's like a complex highway with way too many connections, and so it has to go through a process to improve connectivity and efficiency to begin to look like the old adult brain that has gone through these processes of pruning and increased myelinization. So the cognition is more streamlined, and the various regions of the brain are now working together much more smoothly. So you all are aware now, this has been ingrained in all of us, that the brain continues to develop well into the mid-20s. Young brains have both fast-growing synapses. I mean, it's amazing the rate of growth, and increased myelinization that increase the speed and the efficiency of cognitive processes. And then the brain also goes through a pruning process. And this is where unused connections in the thinking and processing part of the brain are basically pruned or cut away. Neural networks are also enlarging in teen brains, which become much more robust with repetition. So that the experiences that they have, the practice that they get with you in talking about hypotheticals and the communication, that repetition really can enhance their skills. There's also increased activation in the limbic system, which we know to be the pleasure center of the brain. And while there's all this growth and this particular sensitivity in the limbic system, or that pleasure center, at the same time, the development of the prefrontal cortex matures last. And that prefrontal cortex, as you probably are aware, is really what's responsible for planning, for problem solving, and guess what? Impulse control, these things that we see emerge in adolescence. So this discrepancy in brain development with the prefrontal cortex coming on later and the heightened sensitivity of the limbic system serves to provide some insights into that question, what were you thinking? And here's a visual. I don't know how many of you have seen this or not, but this was based on a longitudinal study from the late 90s to the mid 2000s as part of a longitudinal or a prospective study to capture the developmental progression in gray matter maturation over the cortical surface. And what this image does is it really provides a nice visual representation of the evidence that the brain is undergoing this significant remodeling well into the 20s. But brain development is much more complex. There's a lot going on in the deeper regions of the brain, especially with that limbic system. And I love one of these researchers. Her name's Dr. Adrienne Galvan from UCLA, and she's studied that pleasure center in depth. And so what I'd like to do now is actually share a video with you because I've been doing a lot of talking. So let's take a listen to this, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I do.
Hi, thank you. I love your enthusiasm. Your energy and excitement is really what makes me love my job. And my job is to study the adolescent brain. I'm a scientist at UCLA, as Jake said. So scientists have studied the brain for centuries, but it's only been in the last 15 years or so that we've discovered one of the most fascinating things. And that is that your brain changes every single day. As you sit in this room, your brain is changing in response to my voice, in response to the person next to you. And your experiences and the people you affiliate with shape the way your brain ultimately develops. We also know that the brain matures and continues to do so past childhood and into the teenage years and well into your mid-20s. So most of you in this room today, as middle and high school students, don't yet have a fully mature brain. But it's actually really beneficial if we think about one of the functions of adolescence, which is to establish your independence from a caregiver. Because your brain, as an adolescent, is built to help you do that. Compared to children and adults, the teenage brain is really good at seeking out new experiences, enjoying thrills, and seeking out risks. It's also really good at recognizing social or being sensitive to social and emotional information. And so for that reason, the teenage brain is really responsive to rewards and emotions when making decisions. And in my laboratory at UCLA and laboratories all around the world, we're interested in uncovering that very question. How does the teenage brain make decisions? One of the first discoveries relevant to this topic was made when we discovered that the part of your brain in the very front, called the prefrontal cortex, which is the last brain region to develop, because your brain develops from the back to the front, continues to change up until the mid-20s. And the reason this is relevant is because the prefrontal cortex is a part of your brain that helps you think about the consequences or potential consequences of your actions before you do them. It helps you regulate your behavior and your emotions. And so it makes sense that if this part of the brain isn't fully available until well past adolescence, then teenagers may make more impulsive decisions with less regard for the potential future consequences. But we now know that the story is far more interesting and complicated than that. And in fact, what we really need to do is think about how brain regions that are not at the surface of your brain, but in the deeper layers, how they change. And one region we focus on is called the striatum. And the striatum is the key component of the reward system. So when you receive something that you find rewarding, your striatum is very responsive, and it releases something called dopamine. And this is the case not just in humans, but in kids, in mice, in rats, in monkeys. All of these organisms respond really with a lot of excitement in their brain when they get something they like. So in my lab, we study this reward system across development, and especially in teenagers. And we do that by asking people to come to the laboratory and perform what's called a functional magnetic resonance imaging scan, or fMRI. And the beauty of fMRI is that you can take a snapshot of the brain in motion. So while you are experiencing something you like, or while you are making a decision, we capture how your brain is responding to that, how your brain is active. And so to study the reward system, what we did is not simply show people pictures of reward, which is what mostly happens in brain imaging studies, but instead what we did is we actually gave someone a reward. And what's something that people find rewarding? Sugar. So what we did is we asked people to come to the lab. We asked a group of teenagers and a group of adults. And while they were in the MRI, we hooked them up to a straw, and we fed them squirts of sugar water every so often. And first we asked them whether they liked it. Maybe they weren't going to like the sugar as much as we thought. But they actually did. This is a rating scale asking them, how much do you like the sugar? And the average response is in red for the teenage group, and the adults is shown in white. And you can see that everybody liked it, but it's the teenage group who showed this exaggerated sensitivity. They really liked it. So we started to wonder whether there was something neurobiological that represented this difference. So instead of focusing on the prefrontal cortex, which is what a lot of brain scientists who study adolescence do, we looked at the deeper layers of the brain. So in this image, which is actually a real human brain image, averaged together among all our participants, we saw that in the deeper layers, here represented with this this yellow activation, the striatum was really excited to the sugar water. And this was across all age groups. But the really cool thing was observed when we looked at the differences between the teenagers and the adults. Here again, I'm showing you the magnitude of activation, that is how excitable the brain was in the teenagers compared to the adults, to this very simple reward of sugar. And you can see that the teenagers were much more excited to the same exact stimulus and in the same exact region of the brain. It's the teenage brain that was going crazy. It was really excited to get it. And when we associated that with their ratings of the sugar, it was only in the teenage group where we saw that people who showed greater activation in the brain in response to the sugar also told us they liked it more. So that means that in real time, at the very moment your brain gets something that it likes, it will make you think that it's better. And you can think or imagine that in future circumstances, your brain will encode that information and remember that you liked it. So it will bias your decisions toward getting more rewards. And that's what happens during adolescence. But to ensure that this wasn't just specific to something as simple as sugar, we gave people something else that everybody likes. And we did this while they were in the MRI. And what's something else that everyone loves to get? Money, right? Money. Everybody likes money. So we brought in a whole separate group of teenagers and adults, and this time we threw in a group of kids in there who were between about 7 and 10. And we found that, again, the part of the brain that was most responsive was the striatum, shown here on the left. This is a brain scan showing the average activation. But what you can see really clearly is that not only were the teenagers more reactive to the money than the adults, which you might argue is because maybe they have less of it, they like it more, but that's not the case, because the kids probably have even less than the teenagers, and the teens still showed this exaggerated response. So this is telling us that there's something really special about the teenage brain. There's a sharp increase in sensitivity to rewards and novel information from childhood to adolescence, but then there's a sharp decrease from adolescence to adulthood. And that probably has something to do with the fact that the prefrontal cortex is starting to come online as people transition into adulthood and regulating the emotional response to the rewarding information. So what does this all mean for behavior and for your everyday life? Well, there are a few things. From my perspective, this is a really exciting time to study the teenage brain. Although scientists have made significant progress in understanding what makes the teenage brain unique, we still have a lot to learn. For instance, we're just now starting to appreciate that this sensitivity in the brain to rewards and to emotions might lead teenagers to make poor choices sometimes, but it also presents an excellent opportunity to seek out new adventures, to meet new people, and to confront interesting challenges in ways that people don't typically do later in life. And I predict that as we continue to conduct more of this research, we will learn how to take advantage of the sensitivity of the brain during adolescence to generate new ideas and to promote creative thinking. There's a lot that we can and will learn from the adolescent brain and from adolescence in general in the coming decade. And perhaps we'll learn that taking risks and seeking out rewards are really adaptive behaviors in many contexts that actually lead to really good decisions and that help individuals navigate the often challenging and intimidating transition from childhood to adulthood. So with that, I encourage you to savor the excitability of your teenage brain and to enjoy all the new people you meet and all the adventures you take. Thank you.
If folks enjoyed that video as much as I do, I think she just presents it incredibly well. And I rather than me summarizing it, I think it's great for you to hear it from the source. And it does open our minds up to the opportunities for adolescents and gives us greater insights into why they may be taking risks and how we might be, as interventionists, which I've dedicated my life to, how we can take advantage of that and the implication it has for our interactions and our work. So I'll just briefly sum up this aspect on cognitive development, and then we'll take a 10-minute break. So just to sum up, cognitive development for young children, they mostly understand things that can be seen or touched. They may understand a portion of abstract ideas such as love, justice, or even fractions, but their understanding compared to older children, adolescents, adults is much more limited in its scope. And as the brain develops in adolescence, a young person gains a much broader understanding of more abstract ideas, and they're able to utilize more advanced reasoning, though we know how that advanced reasoning can be limited. Another new skill that develops is thinking about thinking, or what we call metacognition. which can help adolescents think about how they learn best, and it can help them find ways to improve how they absorb new information. It can also help them plan for their future and consider how their choices and their values affect that future. Their ability to learn is enhanced with the vast array of structural developments that are happening in the brain. And when you think about the adolescent brain, it's really a learning machine that's evolving in absorbing facts, ideas, and skills. And of course, cognitive development, much like physical development, happens at a different pace for every adolescent. Cognitive developments have important behavioral implications. There's considerable neuroplasticity. That adolescent brain, as you heard, is just highly sensitive to the environment, making it a dynamic and sensitive period and opportunity for learning. The adolescent's increased desire to seek new challenges can be adaptive for learning and exploration, which is critical for independence and problem solving. Changes in social and emotional processing may increase adolescents' ability to adjust to changing social contexts. And yes, they are capable of decision making and planning the future, but brain development sheds light as to why they don't always use those executive functions. And as alluded to earlier, there are many, many factors that influence cognition. There are different learning styles and multiple forms of intelligence. Every adolescent learns and processes information in a different way. Adolescents may find that some academic subjects are easier for them to learn and are more interesting than others. And education theorists suggest that presenting information and assessing learning in multiple ways helps young people with different learning styles. Yet we often see a disconnect with our educational systems. A learning disability such as an auditory processing disorder, dyslexia, attention deficit, or ADHD can affect cognitive development as well. And challenges will differ based on the disability, but being aware of these issues can help adults link adolescents to the proper tools and resources so they can thrive regardless of their different learning styles. For some adolescents, brain development might be more difficult because of earlier or ongoing trauma that they're experiencing. We know how the brain reacts to the environment. And we have research now that shows that experiencing violent neglect or abuse actually stunts brain growth. Being aware of trauma and its potential impact, whether in early childhood or in adolescence, and helping adolescents with strategies to cope can go a long way in improving young people's well-being. As I mentioned earlier, many mental health disorders first appear during adolescence, in part because of these changes in the physical brain development. Um, and adolescents struggling with mental health issues may have decreased motivation or have a harder time with cognitive tasks, such as planning and decision making. So they need that additional support. And adults can support adolescents by watching out for mental health warning signs and providing teens who face such challenges with treatment and support. At the same time, substance use can greatly hinder adolescents' potential by slowing and stunting their actual brain development during this sensitive period. And research is showing that the earlier and the more frequent use of substances like alcohol, tobacco, and cannabis youth can further compound these negative impacts on the developing brain. The brain is also especially vulnerable to addiction during this stage of life. Use of alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs in the teen years is associated with increased risk for adult substance use disorder. And I've talked a little bit about adverse childhood experiences and that effect. And of course, sleep, diet, exercise, all influence how the brain functions. When Children experience strong, frequent, or prolonged adverse experiences, such as extreme poverty, as I mentioned, abuse. They, especially those who have not had adequate support, this stress can be toxic, and toxic stress generates excessive cortisol, which can disrupt developing brain circuits. And this was actually research that was published in the prestigious journal called The Lancet. And it showed that poverty has a direct effect on early brain development through the mechanism of toxic stress. And it is a strong predictor of health problems well into adulthood. There's a vast body of literature that has identified several consequences of insufficient sleep in adolescence. I mentioned I'd circle back to this. Of course, it's logical that they would be more tired and maybe have decreased motivation. That can also contribute to difficulties with focusing their attention. It can increase irritability and reactive aggression, decrease mood, and even depressive symptoms. And then lack of sleep has direct effects on learning and memory consolidation. Teens who have insufficient sleep tend to turn to substances like caffeine or stimulants, that Red Bull, to keep them going. And that sort of contributes to a downward sleep cycle where they're stimulated, they get less sleep, they use more stimulants. We've also seen associations between insufficient sleep and increased obesity and the metabolic syndrome. And there's this negative synergy with sleep and alcohol as well. In this next section, I'm going to turn to adolescent risk-taking because I think this is really one of my absolute favorite areas of research and intervention. Cognitive development during adolescence, as you've heard, really predisposes young people to take more risks than adults. And taking risks is an important and healthy part of growing up. Trying new things gives adolescents the chance to have experiences that can help them make that transition to their independent adult lives. At the same time, it can also contribute to some of that adolescent morbidity and mortality that is largely preventable, which I spoke about earlier today. There's a strong relationship between cognitive and psychosocial development and perceptions of risk, decision-making, communication, and actual risk behaviors in adolescence. And so this next section I'm going to talk about is really focused on adolescent risk-taking. And the early theories of adolescent risk believed that adolescents were deficient relative to adults, particularly with regard to that risk decision making or decisions involving risk. They assumed that adolescents take risk because they don't have enough information or they have inadequate information. They believed that adolescents are not able to judge risks appropriately and as a result have poor decision-making skills. That they are intensely pressured by their peers. And a researcher by the name of David Elkind theorized that there was heightened egocentrism in adolescence, which had two components. One was that imaginary audience. You've probably heard about that. Which is that sense of heightened self-consciousness. It's the belief that others are as interested in them as they are themselves. So kind of thinking that you're under that magnifying glass and everybody's paying attention to that one prominent zit that I had on my chin, right? So there's an element of truth to that. So, for example, an 8th grader might walk into a classroom and think that all eyes are riveted on that spotty complexion. The personal fable is the part of adolescent egocentrism that involves that sense of uniqueness and invincibility. So this is the belief that they are invulnerable to harm. with that said, while there's some elements of truth to these perspectives, there's also some research that shows this is only partially true. Subsequent research suggests that adolescents worry about other people think because there are actual real personal and social consequences. And then research has also shown that the personal fable doesn't reflect the complexity of unhealthy risk-taking behaviors. And in this next section, I'll go ahead and present some of the research, some of the studies that challenge not just Elkind's, but all of these assumptions that we had about that were held, and to date, some still hold about adolescent risk-taking behavior. So I'll do this one study and then we can go ahead and take a break after this. But Dr. Valerie Reyna and her colleagues at Cornell, as well as other investigators, have studied patterns of reasoning in children, adolescents, and adults. And people of different ages were asked to respond really quickly to super easy risk-related questions like, is it okay to set your hair on fire? Or, is it a good idea to swim with sharks? And these studies were done in the 2000s, so they're not that old. They're relatively recent. And what they found is that adolescents took statistically significantly longer to arrive at that obvious answer of no, it is not a good idea to swim with sharks. No, it is not a good idea to set your hair on fire. And while it was statistically significantly different, the difference was about 1/6 of a second longer. So researchers reached a startling and a highly counterintuitive conclusion based on this body of research. And it was that young people take risks not because of the belief that they are invulnerable, but the realities that they're engaging in too much rational calculation when making choices. It's super counterintuitive, right? As I said, they took about 1/6 of a second longer than adults to get to that obvious no. 1/6 of a second doesn't seem like a lot, but it reflects a major difference between the brains of adolescents and adults. Adolescents did not differ much from adults in their capacity to rationally evaluate risk information. They took a little longer because they were evaluating the information. They were considering maybe what kind of shark it was. Was there blood in the water? These kinds of other detailed questions, right? And in contrast, adults were using what we call gist, which is the accumulation of facts and patterns based on experience that allows for that smoother freeway flow, right? That more efficient and faster decision making. Adolescents and adults were very similar on their assessment of risk information. They were similar. That completely disputes prior information and prior biases that we had about adolescent brains and adolescent decision making. They also found that while teens sometimes displayed what we call an optimistic bias, which means that they underestimate the probability that they will experience an adverse effect despite the obvious risks, adults had that same underestimation of their risk probability. So really similar in the way they rationally evaluated risk information. And with that, I will pause for our 10-minute break and we'll come back with a poll question for you. So please take a break, take care of yourselves, get something to drink, take care of your personal needs, and I look forward to having you back in 10 minutes. There was a lot of information that I've shared with you. I hope it's been interesting and engaging. I mean, I can't tell you how much I love this developmental period. But now that we're getting back, as you're coming back in, I have another poll for you. So hopefully you didn't forget during the break. True or false? Adolescents do not differ much from adults in their capacity to rationally evaluate risk information. Okay, so about half of you think that's true, that they don't differ much in their capacity to rationally evaluate risk information, and about half of you think that is false. And I think the confusion here stems from the fact that adolescent and adult brains are significantly different. We know the processes and the underlying structures, as you saw from that video, are very different. However, adolescents and adults do not differ in their capacity to rationally evaluate risk. Adolescents, while they come to the obvious no in that sixth of a second, it takes them a sixth of a second longer, they're still their capacity to rationally evaluate their risk is the same as adults. They're just doing it more, going into more detail and considering more facts, whereas adults rely on just that accumulation of experiences. But the capacity is still there. They just don't always exercise that rationale evaluation the way that adults will. So hopefully the correct answer is true, that they do not differ much from adults in their capacity to rationally evaluate risk information. So we'll go into this a little bit more detail. My colleague, Dr. Bonnie Helpern-Felscher, conducted a prospective, that's a longitudinal study of almost 400 adolescents, and about half were female and half were male. And she examined both the perceived risks and benefits of smoking. She followed youth for 6 months over the course of 4 years. So she assessed them every 6 months for over a 4-year period. And she asked the question, what is the chance that you will become addicted to cigarettes, get lung cancer, or feel relaxed? Compared to adolescents who never smoked, which is shown in the yellow, those who smoked, which is shown in the red, perceived lower physical risks of cancer, heart attack, and lower risks of addiction. And what her research showed, and other studies that came to pass, that adolescents experience with low frequency negative consequences. So getting lung cancer, dying of a heart attack because of smoking, actually decreased their perception that the behavior is risky. So they're engaging in the risky behavior, but they're not seeing the negative consequences for themselves. So that decreases their perception of risk. Another really cool thing she did, she was among the early investigators who looked not just at the harmful aspects of engaging in risky behavior, but what benefits are adolescents getting by engaging in these risky behaviors? And another surprising finding was that those who experienced smoking, again shown in red, perceived greater social benefits than those who never smoked. They perceived that smoking made them look more cool and more grown up than those who never smoked. And I think the take-home message here is that we've really emphasized the risks and the negative aspects and the long-term health consequences rather than attending to the perceptions of benefits that shape adolescents' perceptions of risk. And I can't talk about adolescent risk behaviors without talking about the influence of peers. Peer influence begins at an early age and increases through the teenage years. I actually recently wrote a chapter on the complex influence of peer and parents in shaping adolescent development. It's a chapter in the Encyclopedia of Child Health and Adolescent Health. And we'll be sharing some resources after the training, and the link to that chapter is one of those resources. But what I want to share is that it's just natural and healthy and important for children to have and to rely on friends as they grow and mature. Peers can have a positive and or negative influences regarding all of those preventable health behaviors: diet, ATOD use, engagement in school, what clothes they wear, what music they listen to, the types of movies they like, relationships, etc., etc. Peers can be supportive. They can be a strong source of support and help each other develop new skills, stimulate interest in books or music or extracurricular activities. But of course, they can also have negative influences, encouraging unsafe or unhealthy, risky behaviors. Um, uh, for instance, the majority of teens who use substance or who have substance abuse problems began using drugs or alcohol as a result of peer use or peer pressure. Peers can also pressure others to fit in and engage in harmful behaviors to others who are different from them. In fact, nearly 20% of all high schoolers experience bullying. That was from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. And these rates are significantly higher for ethnic and religious minorities, as well as LGBTQ youth. In fact, a growing percent experience poor mental health because of the behavior of their peers, and they actually report that they're now skipping school because of safety concerns. And peer pressure can happen in person or online through social media. A series of studies by Steinberg and his colleagues investigated how the presence of fear of peers affects the driving behavior and brain activity of teens and adults who are playing a virtual driving game. This game was designed to test whether players would brake at a yellow light or speed on through the intersection before the light turns red. And what they found was that compared to adults, adolescents had a greater number of risky driving decisions and a greater number of crashes when peers were present than when they were doing this test alone. So the blue bar here on these graphs are when they're playing alone, and the red bar is playing with peers. And you can see they're relatively similar for young adults and older adults, but for adolescents, you see that dramatic difference of increase in risky driving decisions when they're with their peers. When they conducted fMRIs, similar to what Galvan did in her study, teen brains, but not the brains of adults, showed significantly greater activity in the reward centers when they were being observed by same age peers than when they were alone. So this study was conducted in a lab, but it does suggest that rewards are more intense for teens when they are with their peers, and that this may motivate them to pursue higher risk experiences that may bring a big payoff, such as the thrill of just making the light before it turns red. So this research is now building off of some of the work that Galvan and her colleagues have done. So while these studies have been critiqued because they did take place in laboratories under these controlled conditions, and they may not necessarily apply to real world settings, what we do see is that there are notable differences in adolescent and adult decision making, though their risk assessments specifically are similar. So adolescents tend to be less responsive to risk information and much more responsive to reward. And what does that mean for our work? I think the biggest take home is that we want to be focusing on the positives that teens bring to the table and build on their strengths. These strengths-based approaches are much more effective. Those positive accolades are much more important, and teens respond to that than a long, verbose lecture about what they should not be doing and why they should not be doing it. Teens just tune out from that kind of information. Teens tend to be more influenced by social factors. They tend to have less future orientation, especially regard with those negative, longer term consequences. They also tend to inflate the prevalence of risk behaviors, which can actually increase their risk-taking behavior. It's based on the safety in numbers belief. What I'm doing is common, therefore it's not all that bad. There's also a sense of ego protection. I'm not doing the same unwise behavior that most of my peers are doing. I'm making healthier choices, right? Even though they might be engaging in similar risky behaviors. They kind of think of themselves as being wiser or more in control. That's sort of the same kind of rationale that my daughter used when she was justifying her friend's speeding behavior, right? We're different than those other kids, you know, he's got better reaction time. We also see that adolescents who engage in risk behaviors are more likely to talk about their behavior than those who don't. So this can lead others to think that the behavior is much more common than it actually is. And of course, there are important modifiers to cognition, there's also modifiers to risk perceptions and behaviors. Teens have lower perceptions of risk when they engage in risk behaviors but don't experience those negative outcomes because they occur relatively infrequently or are longer term in nature. And we see this with HIV research, with car crashes from drunk driving, smoking, so on and so forth. Adolescents with 6 friends who smoke was predicted of lower perceptions of short-term risk, but not the long-term risk. The duration of exposure to parental smoking and the number of parents and family members who smoke predicted adolescent smoking. So that sort of the normative behavior can influence adolescent risk-taking behavior. And we also know that availability and access to alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs influence perceptions and engagement in use. And there's been a big shift to environmental prevention strategies to address this issue. And of course, there's always the affective contributions. They may know right versus wrong, right? They have that risk perception, but it might be difficult to control that behavior, you know, with that slower developing prefrontal cortex, as well as heightened states of emotion and in the presence of peers or distracting stimulus or other competing tasks. There's this hot or cold cognition situation, right? So when a decision needs to be made quickly or in the heat of the moment, they may react more impulsively than in a cold cognition situation where they have time to reflect and weigh their options. We can help adolescents make positive decisions by encouraging them to think through situations in those cold cognition environments and practice, you know, reinforce those neural networks so they develop those skills and their strategies when they're confronted with a hot decision-making situation. I'm actually currently working on a computer-based interactive narrative game. It's super fun. We're working with AI technology with folks out of North Carolina State University, where teens actually have the opportunity to play a game where they navigate a social situation that involving alcohol at a house party. So the parents leave, the teen's home alone. He invites a couple of friends over for a chill evening, and the party gets out of control. And so the youth have to navigate through this character, sort of vicariously learning this party. And we really encourage them to use stop and think strategies where they can stop, reflect on their goals, and make choices on how they want to respond to various situations. So it's kind of a new, exciting technology. So I have another question for you as we wrap up this section. True or false? Adolescents' brains respond more to positive reinforcements than they do to punishment. True, false, or I don't know.
Just a little bit more to go, and then I'll stop it for you.
Okay, excited to see how these answers are rolling in. True. Okay, that's right. Most of you got this one right. Adolescents' brains do respond more to positive reinforcements. That pleasure center is highly activated. It's highly responsive during the adolescent period. Thank you for that. So we've talked about peer influences, and now we'll take just a little bit deeper dive on how adolescent relationships evolve during this period. There are dramatic changes in relationships through adolescence. Prior to adolescence, in childhood, there is an intense family focus. Friendships typically center on same-sex peers engaged in shared activities. And then throughout adolescence, there's a shift towards a greater emphasis on peer relationships. And while the family continues to play a critical role, there's much less of a family focus. And then these peer relationships also shift from same-sex friendships to mixed-sex peer groups with much more intense interactions and peer relationships during middle adolescence and in later adolescence. And then as you shift in later adolescence towards young adulthood, the importance of peer groups starts to recede a little bit, and there's more of a focus on forming stable and intimate relationships. Healthy relationships in adolescence can help shape a young person's identity and prepare them for more positive relationships during adulthood. Gives them an opportunity to practice. Providing adolescents with tools to start and maintain healthy relationships with romantic partners as well as peers. Oops, what happened there? Sorry about that. Is really critical. Adolescents relationships can vary widely and change rapidly during this period. Early intimate relationships are very short-lived, whereas they get older, they tend to last, much longer, a year or more after the age of 18. And there's many influences on relationship quality, emotional closeness and trust. There's physical affection, and there's an exploration of sexual exploration as well. Gender norms and gender attitudes may also impact how intimacy is understood and expressed. And technology is also having an important role in the lives of adolescents. Adolescents today have basically lived their whole lives in a world where technology and social media are ubiquitous. When I was growing up, cell phones didn't even exist, right? And now they've totally transformed our lives. And I think, there's these intergenerational issues when we have to keep in mind that there are huge differences between in-person and online relationship dynamics and the experiences of young people who have had these technologies at their disposal since basically birth. With that said, approximately 8% of all teenagers have met a romantic partner online. And of course, many teens have never dated anyone, but among those with dating experience, about a quarter of them dated or hooked up with someone they first met online. So it's another medium, it's another context that we as adults, we as professionals have to really be mindful of. And unfortunately, our research has not kept up with how social media is impacting adolescent dating. And we have measurement issues and just this rapidly evolving social media environment. But with that said, providing adolescents with the tools to start and maintain healthy relationships really does have a positive influence on young people's overall development. And I'm going to just talk briefly about a study my dear colleague Jason Nagata just recently completed, and I added this in, so it's in your new note slide that are provided for you. He conducted reviews of literature based on the Adolescent Brain and Cognitive Development Study. This is of over 1,100 participants. And they were asked about screen time use and social media use in early adolescence, like around 9 through the years ages 9 to 15. And social media use has become more pronounced since the COVID-19 pandemic, but both cross-sectional studies, so when you're looking across peers at one point of time, as well as longitudinal studies over up to 1 to 2 years, show that higher screen time use, particular social media, video games, video chat, and texting is associated with a range of mental health symptoms, including depression and anxiety, eating disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, ADD, ADHD, and even disruptive disorders, though the effect size depend on the amount of screen time and these various conditions. What they're also finding is that parents' own screen time use and the restriction of use of the screens, say at bedtime or at mealtime, are associated with lower adolescent screen time and less problematic use. I should also note that screen time is associated with sleep problems too, and we know how important sleep is in adolescence. Gender norms, as I alluded to, play a major role in adolescent dating and violence. And many of you are much more of an expert at this than I am, but I'll just go over this briefly. They play a big role in adolescent relationships, as well as the care and services that we offer and provide adolescents. I think in particularly masculinity expectations are often woven into the fabric of our understanding of people and relationships, with that emphasis on dominance and aggression and emotional stoicism. And all too often and all too frequently, males can experience this internalized pressure to fulfill these expectations and assert this within dating relationships. It can happen with either gender, but we see it in the research more commonly associated with males. I certainly don't want to overgeneralize here. And these restrictive norms and expectations can feed into perceptions of power and expectations of dominance and entitlement that can either justify or minimize dating violence. And I'm going to show you this this image of the power and control wheel. I don't know if some of you have seen it. It was created by Domestic Abuse Intervention in Minnesota, but it's been adapted many different population settings, and this is the one, the teen version here. And the idea behind the wheel is that the violence is a pattern of behaviors used to gain or maintain power and control. And the diagram shows the tactics abusive partners use to keep survivors in a relationship. And the inside of the wheel makes up the subtle and continual behaviors that are used over time, while the outer ring is the overall representation of physical and/or sexual violence. And I think this is just a great resource to start understanding the different ways in which certain behaviors that can arise out of or be associated with harmful gender norms start to resemble violence. And we can't talk about violence without talking about the barriers to the stigma around help-seeking care, right? The stigma around this prevents seeking help. It prevents reporting violence, especially when folks need to feel like they need to show their toughness and not show weakness. There's also fear of judgment that might deter seeking behaviors and perpetuate cycles of abuse. So what can we as public health professionals do to help prevent the perpetuation of harmful gender norms and help dismantle the hold that they have on our subconscious? In order to have meaningful conversations with adolescents about relationships and violence, it's important for us all to educate ourselves on best practices and resources. And I know that Caltrin does a wonderful trainings on this topic, so I'm not going to go into great detail here. But these topics are really sensitive to disclose, and sometimes it's helpful just to offer simple information to teens, like what healthy relationships look like, engage in discussions about what they want from a healthy relationship, and that distinction from what violence is and how that can look like a lot of different things. It's also incredibly important to have ready-to-go resources and referrals, and hopefully resources and referrals that are youth-friendly, because not all of them are youth-friendly. Of course, you know how to utilize best practices to explain confidentiality, the parameters of confidentiality, and your requirements as mandated reporters. Um, Part of appropriate and evidence-based interactions around violence is to really center the person who has experienced the trauma using trauma-informed or healing-centered approaches. And some of those approaches involve the use of motivational interviewing techniques, which is that collaborative approach to sensitive conversations, creating that safe space, ensuring privacy, validating the person's experiencing, affirming their courage to share their story, and then, of course, using empathy and non-judgment. And then just being ready to listen and ask those open-ended questions, and even allow for silence. These can be really hard conversations. I think part of youth centering is also discussing how they themselves define a healthy relationship, and then encouraging them to think about their relationships. And motivational interviewing has shown to support these conversations and actually improve their self-efficacy or their self-confidence. There's a wide range of exposures to violence, including witnessing, experiencing, or using violence. And then we also need to be incredibly mindful of our language, as we don't want to re-victimize people in the language that we use. Some strategies are just to mirror the language and the preferences that the youth are using as part of that strength-based approach. There's been a shift from victim as a term to survivor. And then a perpetrator is clearly a charged term, and we have moved away from that term. So again, just being super mindful. We want to always try to be our best to be compassionate and center on the client, on the patient. So I'm going to shift gears now after that heavy topic and talk about the role of parents and caregivers. So I love this cartoon. The caption reads, "How to ruin your teen's entire life. Volunteer at a school event. Go on a weekend family trip together. Insist on a family dinner. Better yet, on a Friday, accidentally glance at their phone when they're on Snapchat." As the teen says here, it's just straight up cruel, right? But we know parents play such a critical role. So how do we navigate this transition and support parents in this process? Diane Baumrind is one of the most famous researchers for her groundbreaking work on the role of parenting styles and child outcomes. And she described parenting on the dimensions of warmth and control. So what you have here is authoritative parents are high on warmth and high in control. They also provide a lot of nurturing, affection, and discipline is typically carried out through guidance, open communication, and encouraging the child to think for themselves. In contrast, authoritarianism is defined as high on control, even higher than that authoritative parent, and low on warmth. In this dimension, parents are often strict, inflexible, controlling, emphasize obeying without question, and employ punitive discipline strategies. Permissive parents are high on warmth and low in control. They're really nurturing and affectionate, but they often have few or even inconsistent boundaries. And then there's been a fourth one added to this work, and this is uninvolved, which is more detached or self-absorbed parenting, inconsistent or no boundaries, and limited interaction. And decades of research from across the globe has explored the relationship between these various parenting styles and adolescent competencies. And what they found in general from cross-cultural studies of child development is that authoritative parents, the ones with high warmth and control with praise and reasoning, tends to help foster a sense that adolescents are responsible for their own behaviors. They tend to be better, well-behaved, more emotionally healthy, a little bit more resourceful, more socially adept, and achievement-minded. In contrast, children of authoritarian parents have that strict rules and punishment with low warmth can stifle growth and independence. Adolescents tend to develop what we call an external locus of control, meaning that the control of their behavior is controlled by outward sources, and they can be showing more aggressive or defiant behavior over time. In a relatively recent international meta-analysis of about 428 or so studies, researchers found that authoritative parenting is associated with at least one authoritative, so that's the one at the top, is at least associated with one positive outcome in every region of the world. By contrast, authoritarian parenting is associated with at least one negative child outcome. And then permissive parents tend to have children with more troubles and are at risk of lower school achievement. And children of uninvolved parents seem to be the worst off in all respect. This is often associated, we see this with juvenile offenders. And while these ideas have been applied all over the world, these 4 basic styles don't always map onto local parenting methods, and parents rarely fall into just one category. There's some flow between these different categories, but it helps us to think, how these behaviors can influence child development. So for example, there was a study of Korean American parenting, and researchers found that over 75% of the population didn't fit into any one of these categories at all. And another study found that authoritarian parenting style, as defined by Western psychologists, doesn't have exactly the same counterpart in traditional Chinese child rearing cultures. So again, we have to take this with a little bit of grain of salt, but there are these patterns that we have seen in cross-cultural studies. Adolescents and their parents also have to negotiate changes in their relationship, including the balance between parental control and adolescent autonomy. Kids of all ages desire autonomy. We can see them, I used to work in the preschool programs, and they would love to put up the blankets over their chairs and make little forts or color in privacy. And they get older, they can put up signs on their door to their bedrooms that say things like "do not enter." So I was actually heavily involved in research on adolescent confidentiality when my youngest child was school age. And what we were finding at that time was that when healthcare clinicians, talked about confidentiality and provided adolescents with confidential assurances, teens were more likely to disclose health risk behaviors. It improved the delivery of healthcare services, and it increased the return rates for follow-up care, which is what we want from teenagers. And on the flip side, when those assurances weren't provided, adolescents, especially those in greatest need, were more likely to forego needed care. So when my youngest daughter was about 8 years old, I took her to her piano lesson. And while we were sitting in the waiting room and just chit-chatting, and the teacher came out to greet us, my daughter turned to me and she asked me to wait outside so she could have time alone with her teacher. So clearly she was overhearing my conference calls during this time. Anyway, as adolescence evolves, autonomy becomes increasingly important as they prepare for their role to adulthood. And so just navigating this is a critical component of parenting and how to exert control over their child in this evolving parent-child relationship. I know I certainly struggled with that. And to some extent, I still do with my children as young adults. What my work and the work of others showed is that parents are experiencing their own adjustment to their child's adolescence. There's some fear and some anxiety. They don't want them to engage in unhealthy, risky behaviors. Parents do want help, especially from professionals and clinicians. They want teens and clinicians to talk about sensitive health issues like sex, like mental health and substances. In general, overall, most parents do support confidentiality, but they also want to be involved in their children's life. They have some conflicting attitudes about this because they feel they're in the best position to help their teen. One of my studies, I conducted over 25 focus groups with parents and caregivers from many, many different backgrounds in different regions throughout California. And what we found is that parents have a particularly negative reaction when the importance of confidentiality is explained in terms of it's the law. This is especially true from historically underserved or marginalized communities where parents in these contexts don't want their teen to be, quote, singled out for fear it will stigmatize their teen as being a, quote, at-risk teen. And we also found the strongest predictor of parental acceptability of confidentiality is their recognition of their teen's need for autonomy. So really helping parents understand that autonomy is a normative part of development, that we recognize this as a challenging time, and that we're here to support them in this process while supporting that adolescent's growing autonomy can be really powerful in getting parents on the same page as we are. Tips for parents: raising teens is no easy feat. And in addition to the research on authoritative parenting, parents need support and guidance and reinsurance. They need to know that their teens need them more than ever. Parents really need to provide teens with support, connectedness, and warmth. Adolescents with positive relationships and connectedness have a greater sense of self and are less vulnerable to peer pressure and that negative peer pressure and that negative or harmful risky behavior. Establishing healthy habits early on also makes that more normative and makes it the default when you get into the hot thinking situations, right? If they've used to saying no, if they're used to engaging in healthy behaviors, it's easier for them to avoid those risky behaviors. I think recognizing that some risk is normative, that teens are curious, they want their independence, and there's growing research that shows that actually overprotection can deprive teens of growth that comes from failing, from these small, quote, safe failures, right? It's important for parents to be involved, to monitor, but to respect their teen's privacy and their developing autonomy. Parents like myself find it particularly difficult to navigate this balance when unhealthy risk-taking has occurred. Even when you know they're friends, this can still be a bit of a challenge. I think it's also important to understand the drivers of teen behaviors and their brain development, that they want to fit in, they want to be like that pleasure center's really activated. We can help teens develop backup plans to get out of uncomfortable or dangerous situations. And I tell parents all the time, be the bad guy. It's okay. It's part of your job description. Engage youth in setting and negotiating limits and the follow through. Listen first and talk later. My mantra is like, look for those openings and lean in and try and stay positive, because remember, they're more responsive to and sensitive to pleasure and to rewards, the positive things you have to say. You can also encourage adolescents to take on new small challenges and build on those small successes over time. That builds self-efficacy and competencies. And discussing the challenges of being true to yourself in relationship to the broader peer culture in that especially in that cold context thinking. And I think it's also really helpful to encourage your adolescents to talk to a trusted adult. Many of you serve that role, I know, about their problems or concerns, even if it's not you. I often said that, please talk to your auntie or your healthcare clinician. They won't talk to me. I've told them not to talk to me because I want you to get the support that you need, even if that support doesn't come from me. working on strategies to handle stress, that healthy engagement in healthy activities and sufficient sleep. And then, of course, know the warning signs. Are they having any sleep problems? Are their eating behaviors changed? Or is there like rapid weight gain or weight loss? Have there been rapid or drastic changes in their mood? Are they skipping school? Are their grades starting to fail? Are they talking or even joking about suicide? Is there any substance use going on with peers or with them? These are all warning signs that we want to take very seriously. And I think it's also important to understand that adolescents and parents are also part of a broader ecological system. And there are a range of contextual factors and life events that shape adolescent development. And so in this next section, we'll explore these relationships a little bit. At the last Caltrin training, I talked a little bit about the social, ecological, and systems theory. I know some of you are new here, but many of you are familiar with this model. And basically, it just shows that there's influences at the individual, their own internal characteristics that interact and are shaped by their engagement with systems in their interpersonal relationships, their relationships with peers, families, that positive teacher or caring adult, characteristics of organizations and the broader neighborhoods and the communities in which they live. And at the larger macro level are the larger socio cultural norms and policies that include access to economics, to jobs, to housing, and to education and healthcare. And here's an example of the, sorry about that. Here's an example of the framework applied to parenting. So there's parenting characteristics that influence parenting behaviors, their personality, their developmental history, their mental health, their own beliefs, knowledge, gender, and age. There's the child's characteristics that influence parenting. Maybe they're really difficult to soothe. They have their temperament plays a role there. The child's gender, their skills, their behavior, their age, and their health status. And these contextual and social factors, their social network, their work setting, work policies about parental leave and flexibility, the neighborhood in which they live in, access to ATOD, the school, the culture, and the supports and lack thereof play a role on parenting, which in turn shapes parenting characteristics, child characteristics, and so on. The strongest determinants of adolescent health worldwide are these larger upstream structural factors, such as national wealth, income inequality, and access to education. These upstream drivers stem from policies and practices that create unequal distributions of money, power, and resources among communities that are largely shaped based on race, class, gender, sexual orientation, place, and other factors. And if we ignore that, then we are really doing a disservice to our teenagers by failing to recognize the contexts in which they live. And as I've mentioned, poverty has that direct and early effect on brain development. Social norms are at the macro level, and they too have an influence at all levels of the socio-ecological framework. These consist of the often unspoken rules of a group, and they shape our behaviors and attitudes. They even influence preferences that we consider private, like the music we like and the policies we support. And those norms have a relationship with stigma, that perception that a certain attribute makes a person unacceptably different from others, which leads to prejudice and discrimination against them. There was a recent 2021 systematic review that identified 10 structural determinants or drivers of stigma. And these include laws, economic policies, media, social welfare systems, and more. These structural drivers contribute to stigmatizing processes that influence beliefs, stereotypes, prejudices, and labels This in turn influences the individual's experiences of discrimination and status loss. I love this figure, and this was taken from that 2021 review. And there are three forms of stigma. There's the public stigma, which involves discrimination and devaluation by others. This can refer to stereotypes that people have. It can lead to different expectations based on conditions that an individual might have, and a belief in those stereotypes and actions taken in response actually affect how they are treated at school and at work and in healthcare systems. Systematic stigma leads to reduced access to care and resources due to policies. And this exists when public stigma stereotypes are really embedded into laws and institutions and organizations that regulate or influence society. And then stigma can influence the sense of self. It can result in the internalization of these negative stereotypes and cut across most of the adverse outcomes for adolescents that we see in terms of substance use, teen pregnancy, STIs, and mental health. And here's a look at the stigma and mental health, right? So as I mentioned, suicide is the second leading cause of death in adolescence, and half of all of this mental health disorders begin during adolescence, but most of these are undetected and untreated. And stigma contributes to stereotypes and prejudice that leads to discrimination and contributes to access issues or the ability to not access services. Public stigma all too often views people with mental illness as dangerous or incompetent or lazy, and it places blame on the individual for their problems. Another article in The Lancet, 70% of people say the media makes stigma and discrimination around mental health worse, which is pretty profound, right? So you can see that interplay there. Institutional stigma is more systematic, as I was alluding to on the last slide, that influences policies of organizations that can either intentionally or even unintentionally limit opportunities. Examples can include lower funding for mental health research, or fewer mental health services related to other healthcare services, or the types of mental health care services that are covered by health insurance. So these are really profound situations. And then stigmatization from family or peers, or even the larger community, can negatively impact how adolescents view themselves and how they interact with another, and care-seeking behaviors. So the National Alliance on Mental Illness has some recommendations about what we can do as individuals to reduce stigma. And these include talking openly about mental health, educating ourselves and others to respond to misperceptions or negative comments by sharing facts and experiences, being conscious of language, reminding people that words matter, encourage equality between physical and mental illness, draw those comparisons. How would they treat someone with cancer or diabetes? Showing compassion, being honest about treatment, normalizing that mental health is just like other healthcare treatment options, and choose empowerment over shame. I fight stigma by choosing to live an empowered life. That means owning my life and my story and refusing to allow others to dictate how I view myself or how I view others. Similarly, the socio-ecological framework can help us understand the influences of substance use. At the macro level, there's social norms, media, marketing messages, there's policy around access, there's poverty and the stress that comes along with that makes someone more at risk for substance use. Opportunities to be connected with others or disconnected can create risks or protective factors. And then there's the interpersonal attitudes of parents, families, and peers, and the own individual characteristics. There was a great study that was described in the Wall Street Journal of how drinking norms contribute and evolve with drinking behaviors over time. So perceived norms to drink, often, as I alluded to earlier, peers often think their peers drink more than they do, which contributes to normative drinking behavior, which is then the drinking behaviors are reinforced. They don't see youth who aren't drinking, the youth who are at home studying or maybe at the library or engaging in other healthy behaviors. And this contributes to the rejection of adult messaging because they want to fit in with those peers. And this is sort of a fulfilling feedback loop. So the more evidence they see of drinking, the more they believe that the typical student or their peer will drink. And now let's take a quick look at the tobacco example. As you're probably aware, there's been a decline in the use of traditional cigarettes. We've done a really good job in health education and in media literacy in particular, showing that the tobacco industry is the bad guy. However, we have a lot of work to do because vaping and e-cigarette use have been climbing dramatically. In fact, in 2023, the vaping industry was profited about $182 billion, and this is expanding at a compound annual growth rate of about 30%. So they are making money and largely off of adolescents. And they are aware of the appeal and the pleasure that their product has on young people. 2021 meta-analysis found that young adults viewed e-cigarettes as a safer alternative to traditional cigarette smoking. And users are able to personalize their e-cigarette use due to the variety and flavors of the devices that are available. And as this ad shows, it tastes and feels better than a real cigarette. No yellow teeth, no smelly clothes. So this is really shaping attitudes and norms around vaping. And a study in JAMA showed that nearly 7,000 kids between 12 and 17 years of age who had never used a tobacco product and who recalled seeing or liking e-cigarette ads were over 1.5 times as likely to be open to or actually trying e-cigarettes than kids who didn't remember those ads. So they do play a role, especially for those who are more vulnerable. And sadly, the tobacco industry has largely outpaced our public health campaigns. Lessons from the past show that these type of scare tactics that you see here on the screen that emphasize those long-term consequences, yes, they do create impactful and lasting memories, but they've not been at all effective in changing the behavior of teens. They didn't pay enough attention to the developmental theory and to the evidence on adolescent risk perception and behavior. Some of you may remember that dramatic and sensationalized ad with the egg analogy, where the egg is like the brain, and then there's a hot frying pan, and they crack the egg, and they put the egg on the hot frying pan, and the ad says, "This is your brain, and this is your brain on drugs," with that movement. And research on adolescents actually showed them actually laughing at that ad, that they couldn't relate to it at all. And it's not just that these are ads of the past. I'm showing this ad because it's really quite recent. We still kind of resort to scare tactics. They continue to be a go-to approach from this ad regarding e-cigarettes. I started using e-cigarettes, but kept smoking right up to until my lung collapsed. That type of messaging is just not as effective for teens. So what have we learned from theory and research? Reducing risk by altering knowledge and attitudes have been remarkably disappointing, to be quite honest. We know that knowledge is essential, but it is not sufficient to change behavior. There's been much too emphasis on risks, especially those long-term, infrequent negative health outcomes. We know that the telling adolescents just say no was not effective. And we've also made the assumption that adolescents who engage in risk occasionally define themselves as smokers or as being sexually active. So we have to be really mindful of how we talk about adolescents and how we ask these questions to assess risk in our research as well. Evidence-based frameworks. This is my passion. This is what I've devoted my life's work to. So we've spent a lot of time on information, but the rest I really want to talk about how to apply this work. Many of you are likely familiar with and practice trauma-informed or healing-centered engagement approaches, which really seeks to apply an understanding that trauma in many ways is a universal experience. And we implement approaches to identify and respond to trauma that's really patient-centered when it does surface. As well as implement approaches that prevent re-traumatization among young people. Fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices are critical, and building on these trauma-informed and healing-centered approaches that de-emphasize the individual and emphasize the importance and the role that culture, identity, and social action can play, not only in the traumatization process, but also in the healing process. They can become advocates or self-advocates and be empowered by that. It's that shift to that real strength-based approach. There's so many examples of trauma-informed approaches. I don't even have time to get into them here, but there is vast evidence that this is a great strategy, evidence-informed strategy. Harm reduction is another approach that focuses on reducing versus eliminating risk. This is particularly among young people with persistently high-risk behaviors who are often really stigmatized by health systems and health education programs. It emphasizes meeting people where they are at. It originated in the substance use field, but it's been applied to many, many other fields. So, for instance, you have a youth that doesn't that won't you want to promote abstinence, say you want to delay the onset of the age of sexual debut, but the teen is sexually active and they're at risk of STIs. Well, you may really want to emphasize condom use in that particular situation. So it's not eliminating the risk, but it's reducing that risk. And then, of course, my favorite, positive youth development. Many of you are familiar with this, but in brief, PYD is a strengths-based approach. They see youth as having the capacity to make positive changes in their lives and in their communities. It really focuses on strengths and promoting people's internal assets and enhancing their external resources by building their strengths and building their connections to their communities, to their schools, to positive peers, and to families. It supports meaningful youth engagement, as well as creating opportunities for youth to make meaningful contributions in their communities. So these building protective factors kind of cluster into these three components: caring relationships, high expectations, and opportunities for participation and contribution. And we've seen that when these core factors are in place on a sustained and regular basis, it improves emotional regulation. It contributes to a sense of hope and purpose for a brighter future. It supports the development of a positive identity and self-efficacy or self-confidence. And it increases those problem-solving skills and those social competencies. And this is particularly important during adolescence. In contrast to PYD is a real shift from a risk-based approach, which focused on changing knowledge and attitudes and resistance skills, such as just say no to peer pressure. And in contrast, resilience or PYD focuses on those strengths of caring relationships, those connections, and the skill building opportunities. And it really reframes how we work with young people. All youth need and benefit from supports, just to varying degrees. That we can really support adolescents build their resilience through supporting their goal planning, goal setting activities, and actively engage youth in the development of interventions as well as their implementations, and that it really takes a community effort. So, how can we apply the science to support positive outcomes for youth? Adolescence is a time of rapid growth, as we talk about. So this is really an opportune time to support them in thinking critically and abstractly and finding alternative ways for them to exercise healthy risk behaviors, appealing to that pleasure seeking and reward processing center that's so highly activated. So what I'd like to do here is, I don't know why that 6 came up first, but I'm going to list some attributes that are often attributed to adolescence. It's called youngism as opposed to ageism. And take a minute and put in the chat, how might you reframe that negative attribute of hyperactive? Go ahead and put some responses in the chat. I'd love to hear what you have to say.
People are saying energetic, excited,
Oh, thank you. It's not showing it.
involved.
Thank you. It's not showing on my chat, so I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah.
Okay, exactly. We could reframe, how might we frame impulsive?
Actively seeking,
Mhm.
committed, curious, spontaneous, alert.
Yeah, responsive, quick on your feet. Exactly. Lazy. Teenagers are often called lazy. How might we reframe lazy?
Relaxed, restful.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see.
Reflective, maybe.
Mhm.
Emotional is another one we hear. Teens are so emotional.
Aware,
Aware, that's a great
feeling,
one.
in touch with their
Mhm.
emotions, insightful, empathetic, responsive.
Exactly. You guys are good at this work. Rowdy.
Let's see what they have to say. Festive. Love it.
Yes. Energetic.
Excited, energetic.
Mm-hmm. And then if defiant, our sort of sick straggler here.
Like strong thinking, enthusiastic, confident.
Mm-hmm. I often say, you stay in your own lane. You don't follow the crowd. Stick to what you believe in, right?
Mhm.
Withdrawn. This was what I was as a young child, a young early teen.
Thoughtful, pensive, conservative, reserved,
Awesome. You get the hang of it. Aggressive?
protective,
Mhm.
passionate.
Awesome. How about rebellious? That I think we hear with what is one thing we hear with teens the most, right? They're so
Yeah.
rebellious.
Adventurous, experimental,
Hmm.
individual, strong-willed, creative,
And then the last one, troubled.
complicated, navigating, misunderstood.
Oh, I love this. You're so thoughtful. Sometimes I even think about troubled, shifting that completely on its head and think about resilience or the capacity for resilience.
Yeah.
So with that said, I have another video to show you. There was an ABC special that was done on the Children's of the Plains. And while this special was really well intentioned, some of the language and images that they used in this special issue perpetuated negative stereotypes. And I just love this because the youth took it upon themselves to create a video to respond to this special. So I'm not going to play the special for you. I just provided the context. What I want to share with you is the youth's response.
And then just to make sure, so since this movie is about 2.5 minutes, I'll make sure to drop the link for the survey if you're still going here in about, 14 to 15 minutes when we close out.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I do have a lot of examples of interventions that I've worked with. And I'm happy to share those as resources because we won't be able to get into them due to sake of time. I planned for 3 hours and my time with you just was so precious and it went much faster. So I think this is a really fun one to kind of close our thinking on. I don't know
I
if
know
you've
you
seen
probably
this.
think of us. I saw this special too.
Maybe you saw a picture. I read an article.
But we're here because we want you to know. We're more than that.
We're more than that. We're more than that.
We're more than that.
We're more than that.
We're more than that.
We have so much more than poverty.
Think, oops, sorry. Teens now more than ever are facing so many challenges, political, climate-wise, everything. They need us as their adult allies more than ever, and they need us to acknowledge their challenges and believe in them and their capacity for resilience and to instill that sense of hope. And it's not always easy to do, that's for sure. Okay, let me see if I can. There's a growing number of interventions that are building on this research that are really showing capacity. These interventions share common features of establishing safe environments, building skills, providing youth with leadership and advocacy opportunities, supporting caring and meaningful relationships with adults and peers, involvement and connection to the communities and schools. It's focusing on the positive and their capacities. I do a lot of evaluation and consulting work with the Friday Night Live program, that has a range of program. And we just published a study that shows how peer-to-peer mentoring can really have profound impacts, both on a range of of outcomes. Here's the article, and I have a link to the resources. And I published this with my young adult who started working with me as a high school student on my youth advisory board, and he's gone on and he's now pre-med and at the University of Washington University in St. Louis. I'm just so incredibly proud and supportive of him, and elevating their voices and giving them opportunities like this. We can think about this in all of our roles. But in this study, we saw, yes, knowledge, yes, skills, but also improvements in relationships and academic domains. I work with another really cool program called Whole Hearts, Minds, and Bodies, which provides clinically supervised nature-based therapeutic mentoring for youth with severe mental health issues. And it started in a rural county in Truckee, California, and it supports paraprofessionals to provide weekly therapeutic sessions where they take kids out in the outdoors and they do they gain emotional coping skills and life skills and empowered mindsets. And we're seeing really positive, some preliminary data from this study. And we now have funding from a grant from the state of California to expand this program into San Francisco County. I have a grant into the National Institutes of Mental Health to evaluate it. With the cuts to NIH, we're not sure what the fate of this research will be, but we are committed to continue to do this good work. And then I've also shifted to technology interventions because technology use is so ubiquitous among adolescents. I talked to you briefly about that interactive narrative game, but I also have developed an app to provide individually tailored sexual health information to support adolescents' contraceptive decision-making, to improve their access to healthcare service and their overall sexual health. And it does this by offloading sexual health and contraceptive counseling from the clinician to a computer, which teens really like to use. And then it supports the clinician by providing them with a confidential summary. And I'm not going to go into details about this. It is now an evidence-based app, and it's in use in 15 states and 57 health settings across the country. But this was not something I just did. It was developed in partnerships with adolescents, with clinicians, with community-based organizations. We needed these partnerships, and community-based participatory research is an evidence-based strategy. It's how we build and how we implement and how we evaluate and how we disseminate and how we sustain interventions in community practices. Like I said, I'm going to skip the slides on the actual intervention, but I do have to show you a really cute picture. So the app has some YouTube style videos of teens talking about sexual health topics and clinicians talking, and all the videos were led by young people. And at the end, we had an Oscar Awards party for them where we distributed little miniature Oscar Awards for their roles as writers or actors or videographers or editors. And it was just such a great way to not only engage the young people and empower them, but to make the intervention more ecologically valid. And when I ask youth when they use the app, what do they like most? They often say, I like the videos. I feel more prepared to talk to my doctor. And a randomized trial of this app showed that, yes, it increased knowledge, but it also increased their confidence in talking with their doctor and in making decisions. And it increased use of contraception by 118%. So it's pretty exciting to see what can be done when we put best practices into place. So with that said, I am going to close. We don't have time for the poll, but I had you reflect on this, and I want you to close with, what do you think about adolescents now? They awesome? Can they drive you crazy? Do they challenge you? Do they inspire you? All of the above? It is all of the above for me, and I couldn't think of working with any other age group the same way that I work with this population. So thank you for today. I think now I channel my favorite superhero even more than before, Elastigirl. I admire her flexibility and strength, and I love how she applies that to her work with her family and her life. And we're facing extraordinary challenges, and you all being here give me hope, and your commitment to advancing health and health equity is so encouraging. And I just want to encourage you all to be flexible and stretch with strength, but please don't break. Face these enormous challenges that we face with courage and hope. And look around, even though we're on Zoom, you are not alone. We are here to support one another, and we have this wonderful resource in Caltrin to further support our work. So thank you all so much for sharing your time with me today.
Wonderful. And on behalf of the participants, Dr. Teb, we want to say thank you so much.